we're being deeply engineered as a society by these decisions being made. And that's why these kinds of debates are so important to have. Because if we've gone too far or we've taken a wrong path, then we got to find our way back. We got to start talking about, okay, how do we get back to a world where women are praised for all of the work they're doing and that we're not comparing their unpaid labor of caring with some kind of career path. These are radically different things altogether.
Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with my amazing daughter, Kelsey Joy Gall. Kels, thanks for jumping on the podcast today.
Hi, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I have asked Kelsey to join us because she was very interested in a really awesome interview that happened on it's on YouTube. It's on the channel Diary of a CEO. It's a debate that the title is Debate is Feminism Creating Lonely, Broken, Sexless Men. But one of the things I found so fascinating, and the debate's about 2 hours long, but there's about a 10, 15-minute clip towards the end of it where they really started getting into some fundamental issues I've heard very rarely discussed. And so both Kelsey and I are like, we were watching this and going, whoa. So you've got Louise Perry, Erica Komisar, and Deborah Francis White. And Louise Perry is kind of the centrist. Erica Komisar represents what she calls maternal feminism. And then Deborah Francis White, she kind of represents more, I would say, just traditional modern feminism, like that kind of more typical, I guess I would say, feminist perspective. So yeah, the oftentimes we know these conversations, people just talk past each other. But I feel like in this part of they actually started a dialogue about the problem in a way that, and it really does highlight a lot of this stuff when it comes to family. There was a moment kind of halfway through the interview where Erica Komisar says, we haven't talked about children. And I know that for me, I was like, oh man, that the problem is if you frame this as men versus women, you're always going to get a certain outcome to the conversation in a society that's obsessed with freedom, with equality, with liberation of everyone, liberation from any responsibility. But and so oftentimes these conversations will intentionally diminish or avoid talking about children and family kind of holistically. They will stay constantly comparing men versus women. And that's where so much of this has gotten off track. And I really appreciate Erica Komisar because she does not let that happen in any of these conversations. And if you've ever having conversations about equality or, what's going on between men and women and these gender conversations, please, please, please talk about family and children. Don't just stay stuck in this sort of, what does he get? What does she get? What does he get? Because eventually we all kind of divvy up what, would be best for our sort of selfish preferences and then leave the kids in the dust. There's a time for that conversation, but we've got to also integrate the conversation about family and children. So, Kelsey, I'm going to play one of the clips for you. We're going to kind of go back and forth on a few of these clips, but I want to share with you guys kind of when this conversation got really interesting. So this first one, it's fascinating. So Deborah Francis White kind of frames the idea of feminism as being this really arduous, motherhood is just this miserable thing that only should or might only appeal to people who are obsessed with kind of a career in early childhood development. Like, listen to how she talks about about motherhood, and then how Erica Komisar reacts to this kind of this framing, this kind of depiction. So I'll go ahead and share this with you.
Really struggling, guys. We need these governments to step up
I agree.
and allow this. And we need corporations to say, you can have a 3-year break and come back if this is the ideal thing. What I would also say is I think it's extremely important for whichever parent decides to be the primary carer to have windows outside where they get fed emotionally, intellectually, creatively. If what floats their boat is early childhood development, and that's enough for them, that's great. That's autonomy. That's awesome. But that is not most people's experience. A lot of my friends tell me that effectively having a child is becoming an unpaid Uber driver for someone who doesn't want to go to karate and hates you anyway. And it's
Ooh, just like listen to that description. What
Yeah.
motherhood is being an unpaid Uber driver to take somebody to karate who hates you.
Yeah.
hard work.
But that is a narrative that I'm going to push back on, which is part of the problem, which is that it's the narrative of misery, which has been promoted. And it's not miserable to have children. It's joyful. It's the most incredible love you'll ever experience in your life, but it's also really hard. And I think we have a bunch of pussies, actually, right?
Wow.
We are producing women and men who are pussies. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. They cannot deal with discomfort. They cannot deal with frustration. They cannot deal with sacrifice or hardship or responsibility. They want it to be easy. Who said raising children was easy? You don't get the good stuff unless you put in the work. And it's the same if you're out in the world. Of course, it's easier to go to a job than it is to stay home with a child because a child demands more of you, but it also gives back more. And I'm going to say this is not a binary equation here. So 66% may want to stay home, but they may want to stay home and have part-time work or do some work from home. It may not be as binary as you're making it out to be. It's not like you have to stay home for 3 years. And it's not an elitist idea. So can I just answer the guilt question? Because I didn't get to answer that because you said you're making a lot of women feel guilty. So guilt is actually quite a healthy emotion. In small supply, guilt is a very healthy. It means that your ego is functioning. So if we're not just preoccupied as women on our own needs and desires and self-orientation and narcissistic sort of wishes, then listen, then we have
Really
to,
trying.
no, I mean, if we're not just concerned with ourselves, then when we leave our very, very, very young children, we should feel badly because those children need us. If we stop feeling badly for our children when we leave them, you break the bond. You can't turn off attachment. So a little bit of guilt means your ego is functioning. It's a good sign. Now, the response to that may not be that you can stay home with your children, even part-time, but at least it informs you. So whatever time you have with your children, you spend it wisely.
Oof. All right, we're gonna start there. Kels, what does that what does that stir up for you?
Ugh. Well, I just think that for what she said at the end there about guilt is such a taboo thing to say. This woman, what was her name? Danielle, is that her name? Uh,
Deborah Francis White.
Deborah.
Yeah.
Deborah. She had a podcast called The Guilty Feminist.
Hmm.
And she brings it up multiple times in this interview because she's talking about how like women carry so much guilt or
Hmm.
we shouldn't be feeling guilty. Like her whole thing seems to be, I don't listen to her podcast, but just the impression I get from her from this episode is that her whole thing is that women need to stop feeling guilty. And I think it's similar to shame in the way that like as a culture, we want to say like, we want zero shame or zero
Right.
guilt. When these emotions are actually, like Erica says, they're meant to inform our decisions. If you feel ashamed about something, then that might be a trigger that you should stop doing it, not that you should live in this continual shame.
Right.
Similarly about guilt, like if you are feeling guilty for leaving your young children at home, that might be a good thing. And if you weren't feeling guilty about that, then that actually informs a potential attachment disorder you might have or one that you're creating in your child.
Hmm.
And I think it's helpful what she says that said that it at least informs you, even if you can't stay home, even if you can't be with your kids as much as you want. That guilt is so uncomfortable that people, if they're in a position where they don't have a choice, then they don't want to feel guilty because they're in that predicament.
Right.
However, she's saying that it informs you to attach to them properly when you are with them,
Hmm.
and to have a healthy relationship and to spend the time you have together wisely. instead of, if you're not feeling guilty at all about leaving your children, then the time that you do spend with them is probably like, there's gonna be a detachment. Like she says, it breaks the bond.
Right.
So I don't think that you would be having as healthy interactions with them with the little time you do have if you are leaving them without a second thought.
Yeah. Yeah. The phrase that she used, "Hey, if early childhood development is what floats your boat, then have at it. Like we will allow that." But for most of us, that's not, and it's such a strange way to think about what it means to have children, that
Yeah.
it's almost like a career choice, a category, and, this is kind of this world in which women and the way she even the way she argues, anytime she's backed into a corner, instead of asking what's best for the children, or what really works between women and children, she'll always go to compare it to men, and I think that is the kind of the move of particularly, like, second wave feminism that I think broke the whole system,
Yeah.
was let's just figure out what men have. Let's make women more like men, make sure that they are equal to men in every way, have the same opportunities, and ignore the impact that has on families and children, and assume that we're both basically the same. And so it's got to be now this career choice that a woman makes. And one of the things that Erica Komisar is really, she's like, look, the real problem here is we have decided as a culture to valorize narcissism. And, Deborah is like the prime example of the valorization of narcissism. She's constantly asking, and even if you listen to the whole 2 hours, just count the number of times when she's, like, working through an argument, she will start from some kind of traumatic experience in her past, and then generalize that to the entire culture over and over and over again, without actually thinking about the fact that you are promoting a culture that would be devastating to children if it were adopted by all women. And so then you have these very brave women like Erica and Louise Perry who are out there saying, "Guys, these are really easy arguments to make. You can always make these really easy appeals to people's narcissism. This idea that we're going to try to get you as women all of the benefits without any of the responsibilities. That's such an easy thing to sell. But man, it just comes at a massive price."
Well, I think what's interesting is that the the way that feminism started was a reaction to how women were being treated in relation to men. And so the early movements were definitely framed as a, like, women versus men situation. Most of them being a lot of them being moms and not even wanting to reject their identity as a mom, but elevate their worth in society as women. And I think if it stayed that way, it would have looked a lot more like what Erica Komisar believes in this maternal feminism, where, you do have more rights and equality with men in society, but the children are not forgotten. And I think that the way that the feminist movement went was in such a narcissistic, selfish, individualistic direction, that it did leave children out of the conversation altogether.
Hmm.
And so I'm just remembering when I read The End of Woman, which is like a whole history on feminism was super fascinating and eye-opening to me. I forget which woman it was, but one of them who wrote some of, like, the foundational, like, feminist documents, I forget her name, um, was just obsessed with homemaking. Like, she would just write these beautiful things about how much she loved laundry day. That laundry day was like, she took such pride in the excellence that she kept in her home, and she had lots of children, and she loved taking care of them. And then the more and more and more, like, further down this path she got of writing these, like, feminist, like, manifestos and such, she, like, started resenting the homemaking and the motherhood.
Hmm.
And that was so interesting for me to read, because this, like, woman who was abused in her relationship with her husband, who wanted to feel more value and worth, fought for that at the
Hmm.
cost of her children.
Yeah. Hmm.
And it wasn't their fault, and she actually enjoyed her role as a mom and a homemaker, but that was the cost. That was the price she had to pay for, like, the road that she paved for women. And I think that, um, it can be really hard to reconcile the fact that we are like they said multiple times that like this table of women said multiple times we wouldn't be here today without those early feminists. Like
Mm,
let's acknowledge
right.
that like a man would not have asked us on his podcast. We would not all be like as educated as we are, and we have all these rights that we wouldn't have without the early feminists, which is true. Um, but you have to acknowledge like the devastation it did wreak on family and children, because the mothers are who is supposed to be the advocate for your voiceless child who doesn't have any rights.
Yeah.
Like, you are the one that's supposed to be looking out for them, and so when you are looking out for yourself first, who's looking out for the children?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm curious, Kelsey, for you, how you would respond to. So one of the things that Deborah Francis White is saying is like all the women that I know that are mothers are telling me that it's being an unpaid Uber driver, taking your kid to karate who doesn't want to go and who hates you.
Mhm.
Um, where is that coming from? Like, where do you think this narrative? Because what she's saying, I think, is the experience of some mothers. And then Erica Komisar is like, you are promoting the narrative of misery, and there's something amazing about having children. Has something happened to cause mothers to either focus on the negative or not experience the positives of motherhood? Like why is this narrative of misery becoming so common?
Um, in my opinion, it's the story that you believe about where your value and your worth come from.
Hmm.
Um, I have been really surprised. I was just having multiple conversations about this, how in even Christian circles, the belief that being a mom is enough, um, being a having lots of children and being their primary caregiver is a worthy pursuit for all women, not just women who desire it or who would prioritize that, but for all women. It's like it's such a minority opinion even in Christian circles, and I think the more and more I am aware of that and learn that, the more surprising it is to me. Um, so my sister right now is in a Christian program, and she's having a great time, like, it's a summer program, but she is the only one in the whole program that wants to be a mom and is not in college. And I just think, like, the the narrative of you have to be educated to a certain degree, like college educated, which I would consider. I didn't go to college, but I enjoy education, and I know that through raising my kids, I am learning so much, especially even in the early childhood years where we're not sitting down and, like, reading books together, but even when it comes into schooling, it's like my education is gonna continue because I need to know what to teach my children.
Hmm.
Um, but in their framework, it's like college educated, which most colleges are, I don't know the actual statistics, but most colleges are just going to have a um, agenda that is much more left leaning, feminist, woke,
Hmm.
even lots of Christian universities. And when you are surrounded with people who have those values and you don't see women who value family and children in that way, then I think you just believe the narrative of misery, as
Hmm.
Erica was saying. Um, I thought it was interesting that she actually said, "Of course, it's harder to stay home with your kid than it is to go to a job." I don't think I've heard people say that. I think
Yeah, very surprising.
I would have said like they're just as hard, or it's just like
Yeah.
you just taking different responsibilities, and you can kind of turn off that like career switch when you go home. For some, maybe not everyone, but some people can turn that off when they go home. And as a mom, you're constantly in it. Um, but yeah, I think you have to believe a certain story about yourself, about um God, and about our culture and our society that makes you enter into the responsibility of motherhood not expecting to be miserable.
Yeah.
'Cause you're obviously like what she's saying, like, who doesn't wanna go to karate and who hates you anyways. Is that like a fringe idea that like, oh, some kids hate going to karate and some kids hate their parents? A lot of kids actually might go through stages of that even if you raise them super well. And the thing that gets you through that is not thinking my life is miserable and no one like recognizes me and no one like sees what I'm doing. the narrative that gets you through that, besides the support of like family, friends, and your husband, would be what Erica is saying is like the long game. You have to believe that it's not just like what I'm spending my 8 hours a day of work doing that's giving me worth. It's the sitting around a table with my children and my grandchildren in 50 years that's giving that moment worth, even though it feels really hard.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Yeah, there's that it stirs up a lot for me as well. I mean, just it's funny because when he doesn't wanna go to so we did taekwondo for multiple years,
Yeah.
and, it's interesting to me to think about how, um, there were times you guys didn't wanna go, and, I think the fact that we were doing it as a family and that I kinda took personal responsibility for, like, casting the vision, like, "Hey, guys, this is why we're doing this." I think so many things it is like you're an Uber driver. In other words, you're disconnected from the rest of your family. You're going around doing things because you know there's no like sort of fatherly vision behind what's going on. You're just sort of like checking boxes or you're feeling kind of peer pressure. Oh, my kid needs to do this. Now my kid needs to do that. And so it's like there's a version of motherhood where you are serving you're expected to give up your individual life and your individual preferences for the individual life and individual preferences of your children. Like,
Mhm.
I hate that story too. Like, I think that's not it at all. Like, we as a family are building something together. This family has been building for generations, and we are going to sacrifice first and sacrifice most as the parents, and then we're going to call you as children into a lifestyle of sacrifice and building, and it's all things we want you to ultimately do voluntarily. But this is why these terminal generations continue to emerge, where you have 10, 20, 30 generations being selfless about like building the family, providing for the family, and then all of a sudden you shift the entire, philosophy and say, now this exists for your comfort, for your personal preferences, for your freedom, for your liberation, so that you can do whatever you want. And there's no sense of duty, obligation, or larger story that you're a part of. And so that never comes up, of course, in this interview. This is something that we talk about a lot. Then they kind of pivoted to this other topic, which I was surprised. It's another one of those things I don't think I've ever heard, at least not recently, this discussed. Like at least not in this way. They started describing the roles traditionally that women play in kind of community building, and then contrast those, and they start debating how to frame that. And this is a fascinating back and forth that happened here. So we'll play this one for you guys next.
Women, it split women. In many ways, the second wave of feminism, women were historically, for millennium, the caretakers of a community, the community leaders. They would check on the elderly, they would feed the poor, they would take care of the children, right? So, what happened is that we took them out of their caretaking roles, and it was like taking a keystone species out of the environment. Much of the environment degraded and shriveled up. That's why we're seeing 50%. That's why we're seeing, in my opinion, that's why we're seeing such a rise in mental illness.
Man, okay, just that's that idea that women it's so interesting to hear somebody use a biological metaphor like that, a keystone species within an environment. So, and all of a sudden you take that and the entire environment collapses, and you have to kind of trace it back to what happened. And so she describes like this role that women used to play, and of course, this is definitely triggering Deborah. So you'll see how that works.
Women aren't going to check on their neighbors anymore. They're not feeding the poor at their local church. They're really preoccupied with making money and materialism and the GDP and a world in which they are no longer caretakers. Now, not everybody's meant to be a caretaker, but the point is, once we lose that linchpin, the society
The
degrades.
ecosystem.
It degrades.
Is it our job to be down at the soup kitchen and checking on the elderly neighbour? Surely that's the community's job. We should raise our sons and daughters to do that. All children should be raised to check on. It's not women's job. I work in a writer's room at the moment.
This is where I think it's so important to constantly pay attention to the words being used. And I wish like I would have a much harder time with what she said if she said, it's not mother's job." And this is why the word women is so this there's a constant tension in this conversation where Erica will describe the role of really mothers, right? And then it gets contrasted to an entire gender. Like, is this only the job of women? And it is this is a very difficult thing to figure out. And all of during this whole debate, I think this is constantly a question I'm having as they're using these words.
And I love it. And I am not less good in the room than any man. I get so much joy from it. It's so exciting. If we say, oh, feminism took away my key linchpin role where I have to like go to a soup kitchen and then check on a neighbor and check on the graphic, while men still get to go into the writer's room and create an animated feature film like it was in the 50s or the 60s or even the 70s or the 80s or the damn 90s, let's be honest. I don't get to do that. The film gets to be more male. It tells the story to the next generation, and the boys get to make that film. And the stories go on and on and on. That my role is checking on the elderly neighbor, and the man's role is to go and write the exciting movie and
No,
create
hang
the
on,
story.
that's not the counterpart. Men do.
I love what Louise does here because there's different ways you can argue for what she's describing here, but what Louise describes here, I think, is really important.
Pro-social things too. They don't just write TV shows. They fight fires, they earn money, they chop wood. I'm being really
But I'm
stereotypical
talking
there,
about what Erica was saying about
Right, but there's
the
a
unpaid
counterpart.
labour of checking.
So can I say,
production.
I think that one of the problems we have in the contemporary world, and this applies just as much to men as to women, we talked about the manosphere earlier, is that gender roles contain both privileges and responsibilities, both of them. So men do other pro-social things, right? And I think that genuinely one of the problems that we have in contemporary culture, having rejected so much of traditional gender ideas, is that gender roles traditionally contain both privileges and responsibilities. So for men, the privileges are kind of obvious, like feminists have drawn a lot of attention to these. But men also have counterpart responsibilities, which includes things like dying for their country or for their family, which includes doing backbreaking labor. There are all sorts of hard things that men are expected to do in exchange. I think this is the unwritten agreement in exchange for those responsibilities, those privileges rather. Women have that too. So women have some privileges. You get to the women and children first principle when it comes to saving lives. Women are often the beneficiaries of what's called benign sexism. So men being kind of deferential to women, like nice gentlemanly men being deferential to women. There's this cognitive bias called the women are wonderful principle, where people will actually, if you ask someone do you want to save a woman that you don't know or a man that you don't know from drowning, people will overwhelmingly choose to save the woman. So there are those privileges. There are also responsibilities, and they include things like caring work, which is hard, and the danger and difficulty of childbearing, which is really hard. And I think that one of the problems, and maybe this is narcissistic, I don't know, this is a touchy word, but maybe this is narcissistic, is that both sexes want the privileges without the responsibilities.
Oh, man, so good. Like, we're a team. It's almost like we were meant to work together in that there are different, like it's almost like we were wired to do very different things, but they're complementary. Like, it's like she's describing reality so well, but you're not supposed to say these things. You're supposed to compare men's privileges with women's responsibility. And that's the trick that's constantly happening. And that's what Deborah was doing. And she could not get away with it with these women. I thought that was remarkable. What struck you about that?
I've actually recently thought about this a lot, not necessarily in the terms of the community, but the caregiving in a family. Mom and I have kind of talked about it because after I had my first, I was really shocked by how difficult postpartum recovery was, and felt like, oh, I didn't really hear like anyone talk about this. And my mom is the one that was helping a lot, like making the food that I'm supposed to be eating, like the nourishing food, and coming once Matthew had to go back to work, coming and like, taking care of me, making sure I get a shower, like all that kind of stuff. And we were just kind of joking because our family all of a sudden is about to have the fourth grandchild in a very short amount, and like within 3 years. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And mom took like a doula course so that she could be at our births. And she was at my 2 births. She's going to be at my sister's. And it's just like, I was joking with her, like, Mom, most women go back to work when their kids grow up and get out of the house. And you're going to be too busy taking care of all the pregnant postpartum moms. And I, I just kind of said it as a joke, but I've honestly thought that, like,
Mm.
there are certain things like on social media I've seen that are like really cool places, like spas and resorts that people can go to for like postpartum recovery. Some of them are like in Asia, where like nurses will take care of your baby and they'll feed you really nourishing meals and you pay thousands of dollars. And there's like all these healing things like I don't know, like saunas and pools and whatever to like just focus on healing. And I'm like, "Oh, that looks really tempting," but it's, like, super expensive, only really rich people get to do this, and then I realized, like, if everyone had a mom that was still taking care of them as an adult, you wouldn't need a special resort like this to go to heal after you have a baby.
Yeah.
You can just do it at home, your mom taking care of you. And, so that's, like, the very small way in which I haven't thought of it for, like, a society as a whole, like the elderly and the poor and things like that being the role of, mothers. But I do think, like, if you just start with the people in your family, and if you're actually, like, the stay-at-home mom role changes. Like,
Mm.
it's still being a mother is still your primary identity or can still be your primary identity, even when all of your kids become adults. Because if you raise them to get married and start having children, and then they do that, and then they all start having children, then you have daughters and daughters-in-law and grandchildren to start helping with and caring for, and that becomes the village that mothers so desperately need.
Right.
Um, like, people complain all the time, like, I wasn't meant to be, like, a personal chef and an Uber driver and an educator and, like, all of these things, like, you lots of people can't do that alone, and that's why it is meant to be done, like, as a family, and if you don't have that upstream, then you can start working on creating that for your children and being that person.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mom and I did a podcast a couple months ago because of a article, about this Ugandan woman who was living in Switzerland trying to have a baby. And it was so difficult, so miserable that she moved back to Uganda because she was immersed in this village that you're describing. There was aunties and there was her mom was there and a grandmother and all these people were there. And they were very much like cheering them on and like helping them with postpartum and so you have this dynamic. We've destroyed that dynamic, and I think it's really important to say to any women listening to this that, a lot of you have to decide, are you going maybe you didn't receive that kind of care. Maybe your mom's not there for you and this village has been sort of eradicated. You can build this for a future generation. You can decide to be the mother, the grandmother who is helping, right? That's something that you could set as a goal. Maybe it's something that's difficult to achieve financially, but it's something that you really want to consider as a vision. But part of this goes all the way back to kind of the debate that they're having, and that is you cannot denigrate unpaid caring work that needs to be done in the home. You can't primarily evaluate the value of caring in the home through an economic lens. It is not susceptible to an economic lens. It's not a part of the GDP. Do not think about that work in that way. You have to think about it from the perspective of family building, which is more important than the national economy to the person in that family. And this is where all this is broken down. If you're not in a family building project with your husband, and then preferably with your multi-generational family, then everyone kind of disperses to the wind and this keystone species gets ripped out of the
Mhm.
environment. These caring women who really understand, have the skills, have the desire to protect the relationships within a larger multi-generational family structure, to care for all of the people within that structure as it grows and multiplies rapidly. And this is another problem, is that some multi-generational families are basically ceasing to exist, right? So this is a problem they're having in China. You'll have four grandparents trying to fight over one grandchild, and they know that they'll only ever have one grandchild, and they've actually have a memory of what it looked like to be in this sort of caring, sort of more village-like relationship. But the policies of the government destroyed the multi-generational family in that culture, and so it's now China is in this terrible population collapse. But we have to decide for ourselves, like, are we going to set up the kind of family that multiplies? Louise Perry, earlier in the interview, she was quoting Elizabeth Warren, right? She is kind of a famous senator from California, very liberal. But before she got involved in politics, she was really researching this two income dilemma that was created when the banks started to look at both a husband and a wife's income, combine them to decide what kind of mortgage that family could afford. And as soon as that occurred, the housing prices went through the roof because it drastically increased the amount that a family where both a husband and a wife were both working, what they could borrow. And so then it really created a situation where a single income in many, many locations around the country was you were incapable of getting a large enough loan to have a house. And this problem is getting worse and worse and worse. And so it's really important to understand that when we have these conversations about sort of the ideal design of the family, the ideal design, it has massive ripple effects on everything, on economic policy, on governments, and on on children, and on larger kind of cultural, like you were saying earlier, the value of this kind of work, is it going to be devalued? These are things that happen, that aren't just sort of internal preferences. We're being deeply engineered as a society by these decisions being made, and that's why these kinds of debates are so important to have, because if we've gone too far or we've taken a wrong path, then we got to find our way back. We got to start talking about, okay, how do we get back to a world where women uh, are constantly being um, praised for all of the work they're doing, and that we're not comparing their unpaid labor of caring with directly against some kind of career path, and just say these are radically different things altogether. One is the project of family building, which is very different, and we're not going to invade that project with all these other incentives and metrics. And then, of course, the career world is going to look, and it needs to be its own thing. It's not the same thing.
Have you ever considered starting a family business so you can spend more time working as a family team? We've started a year-long coaching program called Family Inc., where you get weekly coaching with Jeremy, access to our video training for launching family businesses, and lots of ideas for businesses to start that are working for other family teams. Head over to familyteams.com and click Family Inc. to learn more, or to set up a strategy call with Jeremy to see if this might be a good fit for you.
So, anything else that this has stirred up for you?
Um, I'm remembering a time when mom and I had our quilt shop and we had a lot of like elderly customers or just women that were like, 50 plus somewhere in there. And um a lot of them used quilting as like a form of therapy or, something to keep them occupied since they were retired. But then we started realizing how many of them were also full-time caregivers. Either they had disabled children or elderly parents that they were taking care of, and or grandchildren, um, that they were the full-time caregiver to, and it was a lot. We started making a list because, in the shop, we would just get to talking to people and just start to recognize their stories, and we started one Christmas, we made a list of all the women we could think of that we knew were, primary caregivers, and we made them um, like gift baskets,
Hmm.
and Kyra wrote a little poem called "Who Cares for the Caregiver?"
Hmm.
And I think that that's like it was really beautiful to see that. But I think it was also still sad. Like I think that these because that wasn't a role that was like recognized, these people were still feeling so alone in their role as caregiving
Hmm.
or as caregiver, and they weren't being cared for. And I think if it was more just known and understood that mothers from the time that you get pregnant with your first child, until you are physically incapable and now you're the one being taken care of, if it is understood that you are a caregiver to your young children, to potentially disabled children, even into adulthood, to your elderly parents, if care to your postpartum and pregnant daughters, if you're just if that was like a primary identity that people saw when they looked at women, I actually think that you would feel more recognized
Yeah.
for the unpaid work that you're doing. Um, but because it's not a societal norm, a lot of that work goes unseen. And so people just assume that no one's ever going to see the work that I'm doing. And it can be really difficult. Like that is difficult. I'm not trying to say that it's not.
Right.
But if it was just a more, either known thing that everyone just knows, okay, you have kids or you have older parents or something like that, you're a caregiver and recognize that, or like other women see that in each other because we're all doing this together.
Right.
Either we recognize each other's efforts in doing that, or we're even able to help each other's efforts in doing that. And so I think that we have come so far away from that as the narrative that it's really hard to envision a future where that could
Right.
happen again one day. And I don't know how to make that change on like a national level, but just with your families, when you start to make that change and you
Right.
have other families around you that have made that change, then you don't feel like you're carrying that burden alone.
Right. Yeah, this is where kind of Deborah Francis White's kind of perspective breaks down so spectacularly, where she's primarily asking, what is your preference? Like, do you prefer to do unpaid caregiving? Well, I'm
Mhm.
sure there are a few people out there that might prefer to do that. And if you don't prefer, then you don't do it. Well, the problem is, as Louise Perry pointed out, there's actually an exchange of duties happening, right? You don't ask men, do you prefer to be blown up on the battlefield? Do you prefer to give your seat, to a woman? Do you prefer to go out in the middle of a storm and reconnect those power lines? Is that your preference? And for most guys, it's like, no, this is something that I feel like I'm wired to do for the sake of the family, for the community. And that's what's driving me. It's not primarily my personal preferences. And so and this is so you can take keystone species out, whether they're men and they no longer protect women, they no longer protect societies, they no longer do the hard, dangerous or backbreaking labor, or you can say to women, just give in to your preferences. But what happens is once somebody makes that move, once somebody decides, look, I know I'm getting these privileges, I want to continue to get these privileges, but I'm not going to do my duties over here. Well, then what that does is it causes the other person in the exchange of those relationships to abandon their duties because or to stop giving. And so this whole thing, it's a race to the bottom. And that's what we're experiencing right now between men and women, the manosphere versus what's happening with feminism. It's a race to the bottom instead of saying, hey, let's continue this arrangement that's been working for, hundreds or thousands of years to build families. And yeah, there might be some updating, but in general, we want to really honor and respect one another's different gifts and responsibilities in this and make sure that we are protecting the privileges that are given to both of us in this exchange. We're both trying to fight for how can I get more of my preferences kind of catered to, and this just breaks down everything. And so you can't let people get away with this because it is a society wide problem. These are not individual decisions. You don't say, when men turn a certain age, because they're men, they have to sign up for the selective service. They have to be eligible for the draft. Like because you're a man, like that's one of your responsibilities. You have to be prepared to defend the country. But what we haven't said to women is, look, part of this is in your case there are caring elements to how you're wired and what our society needs and what our family needs from you that also need to be honored. And what Erica Komisar is constantly like going after is this idea that as young as possible at 8 weeks old, you separate from your infant and put them in daycare, and whatever guilt you feel that might be triggered by the fact that what you're doing is actually very harmful to that child, you're going to get just lots and lots of salve from the Guilty Feminist podcast to say, don't feel bad, just do it. Your kids, like you're important, you're worth it. Ignore that, and so on it goes.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Kels. I think it's a really challenging thing. I thanks for sharing the podcast with me. And I feel like this is a conversation that is
Yeah.
so important. Like we need to be paying close attention to how these things are colliding. And I really, we're pretty hard on Deborah Francis White, but one of the things I really like about her is she said this publicly, like, she wants to engage with conservatives. She's
Yeah.
excited to talk to religious people. Like, she's willing to have these conversations. I think that's really admirable. I think we need to be having these conversations, and I'm just really, man, so interested in how we as a society, where this shakes out, because this is extremely important for us to kind of come down on proper understanding of how God designed men and women, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, families, and individuals. So yeah, thanks for jumping on here today.
I felt like I've been talking to everyone about this podcast because it's just been stirring so much up and so many
Yeah,
interesting ideas. But one of the things that I was really surprised by in myself was how much I agreed with Erica, even though she says that she is a feminist. And I think what the realization I was coming to was that if feminism today, widespread, looked like the maternal feminism that Erica Komisar was promoting, I would have very few objections to it, and the only objections I would have would be based on my Christian faith. The fact that she, as a non-believer, is able to see through all of, like, the woke, agenda of feminism to see, like, at its core how it has degraded, the society when it comes to familial roles and gender roles, but then also see, like, the potential strengths that it had, in, helping women in whatever way without going too far. I actually think she's found a very unique balance,
yeah,
and some of her beliefs are still, like, would not align with Christian values, but still, as a society, I think I would be a lot more accepting and respectful of feminist ideas if they were coming from that lens.
yeah.
And I think it was interesting for me to even just process as a believer, what is that? What do I believe about this? What is that? How do I think that that should look like, for the secular culture, but then also for myself and my family?
100%. Yeah, I think her lens, I think she was raised in a Jewish family, and I think that often, for me, has always been like there's something they have preserved, and they can see because of the multi-generational nature of the way that they see the world. That is such a gift. Like, we desperately need, as Christians who are oftentimes being completely inundated with one generation or two generation only perspectives on the world, even within the Christian world. We need these Jewish voices because they tend to have this multi-generational like wisdom, and so they can see through things. And I've noticed if you take that frame on, man, it's incredible how much wisdom there is. You can see through so much of the negative things, and what, instead of saying, well, what do I want, you can see, oh, where that will lead. What would happen if my grandchildren didn't were not able to be raised in a healthy multi-generational family like I was. Like, these actions are going to erode that, so having this incredibly short 20, 30-year time horizon that we're obsessed with in our culture is causing so many problems. So yeah, I'm hugely grateful for her and for the whole Jewish community, in preserving so many of those multi-generational perspectives on family and life. So
Yeah, and I think that what was interesting to me about Deborah is the more she revealed about her story, the more that you could tell that her beliefs are totally informed by the trauma that she's
yeah,
experienced in life. She grew up in, like, a cult, and she's unable to have children and, like, all these different things that I'm like, but she says she's like a voice for all women.
right.
And
She's generalizing a very specific set of circumstances. Yeah,
yes, and I'm like, I can see why you would believe that based on the experiences that you had. But to say that this is what all women want or this is what's good for society as a whole based
right.
on the trauma that you've experienced is just projecting your
That's right.
experience onto everybody else. And I don't think that Erica or Louise did that, and they
Yeah,
had just a more well-rounded, I would say, perspective. While I do think Deborah articulated herself well, it was just like, okay, but still,
right.
that was based on your, like, tragic experience.
Yeah, it's very important to understand the foundations. Erica Komisar, she's a therapist for young children. She really understands how young children are being impacted, and then Louise Perry is just a brilliant researcher for these kind of macro trends. Her research on the sexual revolution and the actual results, the impact it's had on women. And so there's several times in the interview where, particularly Louise Perry would like, Deborah would say something that was much more of like, but women want this. And then Louise would say, that's not in the data. Like, that's what you want, or that's what your experience. but look at the data. Like she said something at one point where she's like, I go to feminist rallies and I see children everywhere. And Louise Perry is like, that is not true. Like that may be true in some place you went, or how many children you think is children everywhere.
Yeah.
But she's like, there's no one's having less children than progressive liberal women. And so, yeah, it's really important to separate our, individual circumstances from when we're having conversations about like culture, society as a whole, or biblical values. Like we need to really look at some of those bigger pictures. So awesome. Cool. Well, thanks so much, Kels.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.